Previously on this podcast.
And we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of Memory Alpha.
Hi, hello, I'm Dan.
I'm Harry.
Jan and me both started the German Memory Alpha. Dan and Harry started the original, the English Memory Alpha. Is it true that you started it in November 2003 or?
It wasn't that much sooner than that. It took a little while, but only by a couple of months.
And I also had my own website. And my experience was, it's fun for a few months and then you lose interest. And
for the first couple of months, it was on my website. I just set up a subdomain as we were getting things up and running.
And what drew you to the conclusion to also include the animated series? That was, I think, controversial at that time, right?
It was at the time.
And now the continuation.
Okay, I was on the main page of the English version of Memory Alpha and I looked up the first version and it was from November 23rd. And it said Memory Alpha consists of 770 articles. That was way before we included the, the variable where you see the actual number.
Ah, yeah.
So it was written by hand, 770 articles. And I was wondering if maybe Dan or Harry already wrote about 800 articles and just included this in the first version of the Memory Alpha.
As I recall, that was a big part of the early stages of setting up Memory Alpha, was just creating the skeleton of it. We needed to have a page for every episode, and that was a lot of work at first. I remember I kind of moved over some things from my own personal database, manipulating text, creating the wiki text, the buttons for next episode, previous episode. That was a lot of work and a lot of text massaging. So there were a lot of those pages and edits that had to be created. So I'd be willing to bet that at least half of those articles were probably just placeholders for the episodes themselves. And then people would go into an episode and link and say, all right, Spock was in this episode, create the link for Spock, and then it could, expand from there.
Funny that you mentioned this because I actually dug up something I did 20 years ago on the German version, and that is actually also my way to approach this thing. So I was writing the help pages, the internal Memory Alpha pages, the boilerplates, and then I started with Next Generation, the original series, Deep Space Nine, or the episode lists, and Yeah,
and then came me. So I just had to look up. So I expanded your Next Generation page with listing all the different pages there and bringing the Star Trek content in there. I remember you trying to stop me editing and while you were still setting up the environment. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things that really, I think, was so successful about the wiki format, was just exactly what you were doing, Jan, is that you see this project and you think, oh, I don't have to do it all myself. I can focus on just the parts that I'm interested in and write a few articles about that and then move on. It was definitely very scary because of the idea of not being so protective of the whole project, letting other people say what they want, and it doesn't necessarily match your own view of what is in the show. And from all of that, it took a while. And I know that there was a lot of, Florian, you mentioned the boilerplate and the help articles because so many people just didn't even know how Wikipedia worked. So I do remember putting a lot of those guideline articles up to kind of help inform people who may or may not have chosen to actually read those pages, but at least we had a reference to point to help kind of set some guidelines that we could at least all agree on.
Just a question. Now that you mention it, I know I copied this more or less or translated this from the English Memory Alpha. Where did you get your reference for the policies and guidelines and the help files? Did you borrow it from the not Memory Alpha, from the Wikipedia, or did you?
Yes, I did.
Work
a
it
lot
out
of that
yourself?
was borrowed from Wikipedia and a couple of the other early wiki websites.
So,
Yeah, I think Wikipedia.
Mostly Wikipedia, but I think there was another general purpose wiki that was using different software, but that had some community going at the time.
So we are standing
Don't
on the
remember the name
shoulders
of it.
of giants.
Absolutely. That was something that, Wikipedia was the first general purpose encyclopedia, and I don't know if Memory Alpha was literally the first fan wiki, but I think it was definitely the first one that really took off.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was actually looking at that today because there were a couple of wikis around at the same time. The Battlestar Galactica one, the Star Wars one, the World of Warcraft one. Those were all early wikis, but I think the earliest one I found started in 2004 for Warcraft. So I think Memory Alpha might at least one of the first. Let's say that.
We're on the top 10. Let's agree on that.
Yeah.
And we are constantly linked on the official Wikipedia pages. If you want to have more information, have a look in Memory Alpha.
Yeah.
Harry, you mentioned that Memory Alpha moved from the private server to the commercial server. I just say commercial server because, WikiCities is more or less a commercial company. But WikiCities has some connection to Wikipedia or Wikimedia. Can you describe this?
As I understood it, the founders of WikiCities, I'm not sure if they even had that name when they contacted us, were also members of the Wikimedia Foundation or Wikipedia Foundation. I think we were first contacted by Erik Muller. I think what he provided was basically a managed hosting for Memory Alpha, with the trade-off that we would have some Google Ads on the side. That's how it started. But then he would host it for us and I think keep it updated for us, the software.
So you didn't pay for anything, it was for free. And because it was for free, someone has to pay for that, and then there were ads on the side.
Yep, that's correct.
So it was never an ad-free or, let's say, non-commercial product.
Only when we hosted it ourselves, and then it moved to WikiCities. Then it became, then it got advertisements to pay for the hosting.
On Memory Alpha, you have a certain license for the content, for the text content. And this is Creative Commons share alike by, so you have to attribute. And it is non-commercial, is it?
Share alike is not in there. It's just Creative Commons by and non-commercial.
And you chose the non-commercial part to appease, what was it, Paramount at that time, the license holder of Star Trek, the franchise?
Basically, yeah. I mean, as I remember, I was doing some research. Wikipedia at the time had a different license. They were using, I think, the GFDL license. And even at that time, there was some discussion about that not being a great license for Wikipedia. So I was already, seeing some information about Creative Commons. So that seemed very attractive. And I remember thinking that at the time, the most reasonable thing to do would be to make it non-commercial to help appease and to hopefully reassure the Paramount lawyers that this is not something where we're trying to make money. And from that, we just kind of put that license in there. And I don't think any of us really considered quite how long-term this project would be, because we have legally been, kept with that license. I don't think it's really hurt us too much. But at the same time, there have been a couple of conflicts, because I know between Memory Alpha is on the BY NC license, Memory Beta is on the BY SA license, which is what most of the rest of the fandom wikis now are on as well. So it's a trade-off, a little bit inconvenient, but within Memory Alpha itself, it's not a huge deal.
If you had known that Memory Alpha nowadays is such a big brand name, or let's say it's a brand name, it's maybe a big brand name, let's discuss this later. If you would have known that Memory Alpha would become a big name, would you have hosted the service on your private server? Or was that out of discussion all the time because it was too expensive?
I think at the time it probably was too expensive. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I did not have I was in college and I didn't have a regular job until, 2005 after college. And even then, of course, I had other obligations and such. So I didn't really have a whole lot of budget to maintain that. So there was definitely a real attraction to that. Do I have some regrets about that? A little bit, yeah. Would I love to be still, a little bit more, hold on to that and shepherd it to keep it a little bit more, focused without all the distracting ads? Yes, would have loved to keep that. But I don't think there was any practical way that we could have gotten that, because it did just grow so big with all the server requirements.
Yeah, and of course the server updates and software updates. If you would start it now, obviously it would be hosted in the cloud, some kind of virtual host, not very expensive. But back then, web hosting was a bit more involved. You had to have a dedicated server, I think.
And Harry, you mentioned server updates or software updates, and that just reminded me of the time fairly early on when I botched one of the software updates for the Wikimedia software, and we lost 6 weeks worth of updates of the content for Memory Alpha. That was in early 2004, first half of the year at some point. So it was still relatively new. So it felt really scary. And I was like, oh my goodness, what did I just do here? And, of course, at that point, there were enough contributors that we kind of recovered relatively quickly. So at this point, it's just a footnote, but that was the sort of thing that we had to deal with to maintain all of that software. And I have a personal interest in technology, but I didn't have any experience running a server. And so, I was just trying to figure it out as I went along.
Yeah, I remember it was almost like a new start, basically, from there. But yeah.
And do you remember the timeline, Harry? So you founded Memory Alpha in 2003. And I just looked it up. Wikicities was founded in 2004. So you ran the server for more or less a year.
I think so, yeah.
And you got contacted from Wikicities at that time, so you didn't apply, but they came.
Yep. They came to us. To help us hosting with this wiki, maybe because we were one of the visible MediaWiki installations out there.
I know that I was in touch with one or two people at Wikimedia because I was trying to figure out how to get the software to work, and it was relatively brief conversations, but I think that's how they became aware of us. And then as Memory Alpha started to grow, then there were more people and they realized, oh, this is actually a successful use of our software.
Yeah, I remember back in the days, they even, I think they or you, I don't know, I don't remember. I vaguely remember that there were downloads for the database. So I could download the complete Memory Alpha wiki database and then have this database installed locally on my computer and play around with it. And I think I did some statistics back then. I'm not sure, but I think there was the opportunity to download the database at some time. Did you do this, or did WikiCities do this?
That I think that was a general service, because I remember that I connected a bot that was using exactly this feature, that you could download the database, crawl it, and then search for typos, missing links, correcting links, and so on. I think that was a standard feature of the software, actually.
I think so too, because I'm pretty sure Wikipedia had that back before Wikipedia was too big to download.
So the database itself is just the text, but it's accompanied by all the media, and I think that is what's still today the more expensive stuff. For the database, it's more like providing fast access, and that pages load fast, that the content can be rendered correctly. But
as I recall, I mean, early on when we were starting Memory Alpha, we definitely focused a lot on text, and there weren't a whole lot of pictures. It was usually most articles didn't have any pictures at all, and then there were some articles that would have just one picture, and that was enough. And some of the longer ones you'd add 2, maybe 3, but that was usually about it. Now I think it's great because it definitely makes the material a whole lot more immersive and easy to follow along, where you have, so many images to illustrate. Like for character articles, I love how they have both their first appearance and their last appearance. So you can see what they looked like, for comparison. That's a neat idea that I no idea who had that whenever they started doing that in the template. That was a neat way to help integrate media into those biographies. But we didn't really focus on that in the early days, just wanted to have the content, the text itself.
I just had a look. Jörg joined in September 2005, and he has 18,000 edits. So.
Oh, is that all? Oh, Jörg is unstoppable there. It's awesome. I know that with a lot of my early edits were just little maintenance things, so that was something that kind of built up over time. Although honestly, the things that I'm most proud about with helping to get started was that by starting from the Star Trek Encyclopedia, all of those entries were just so incredibly short. If you had a 4-sentence entry, that was long. And so there were so many summary details in there that got lost. And I wanted to really flesh out that. It also helped. I was in college. I was a history major, so I loved the potential for storytelling to help weave together these events from one episode to another to another. And I think an early example that really kind of set the tone was I wrote a big chunk about the Klingon Civil War in Next Generation. So I started writing it literally like a history essay and telling the story of how Chancellor K'mpec was dying or assassinated, and then the struggle for leadership between Gowron and Doras, and then the events of the Redemption 2-parter and the actual conflict. And so I think with those types of stories, that's what really excited me, was to be able to make it not just a complete encyclopedia, a complete reference, but also that we could use it to tell these long form stories to help put in as much detail and interpretation as was necessary to help make it a more complete reference. And I think that really worked well. There were a lot more articles that came after that one.
Yeah. Was this when the featured articles were started?
Possibly. I know featured articles is probably another thing we borrowed from Wikipedia, but would be around that time probably.
Yeah, what I also really liked about those days is you could clearly see different people having different interests and really focusing on their part of Star Trek. Like I myself was always obsessing with aliens and especially the Federation members, and I really liked fleshing out some of the animated series stuff. And yeah, you made like historical articles about what actually happened. And I also remember people like Charles Trotter, who somehow found out everything about background extras, and every actor that ever appeared wrote whole articles about them. I thought that was really amazing. Like, okay, here's someone, you see him for 5 seconds. This is who he is. This is all the other people he ever acted with.
Next time on the podcast.
I also remember there was already a page out there that there were recurring characters that had 1 or 2 or 3 names. I think that was then also put into Memory Alpha.
Where did you get the information about that?
It was from the encyclopedia and from the episodes. Everybody's mentioned Bernd Schneider and Exastra Sarantia and Flair. I think that's really a common part here. Flair is where that's kind of the nexus point, because that's when Harry brought up the idea.
Yeah, Jörg's observations can be a whole podcast in itself.
Yes.
Credits for Memory Alpha, and I know that Mike Sussman was contributing materials towards the last season of Enterprise.
Yeah, I think that was one of the first times someone from actual Star Trek noticed us.
And the email subject literally said, from Simon Pegg. The email was describing how he'd been using it for all of the references.